us about Russia. We've been doing Russian sanctions. Before we get into if the sanctions will impact all of us, what was Russia providing first Europe and the United States in terms of energy?
Russia is an extremely important player in energy, particularly many commodities. But in terms of energy, Russia has been, until very recently, the second largest exporter of oil to the world. And it has been Europe's largest supplier of natural gas, providing something like 40% of the natural gas that's consumed by Europe across the continent, 60% of the gas that Germany was consuming before this crisis.
How much does it really hurt Russia in terms of in the short term, let's say, versus if this continues for a year?
Energy embargoes and sanctions have a pretty lousy track record. And historically, the Arab embargo, for example, from the 70s was a flop. And the main reason, a great guru at MIT, Maury Edelman, argued on the pages of The Economist back then. He said, if the Arabs won't sell us oil, somebody else will. Basically, it's a fungible global commodity. Every barrel is more or less connected to every other barrel. And so if you say that America won't buy Russian barrels of oil, but it still has a market value because the world is addicted to oil at the moment. We consume 100 million barrels a day. 2021 saw record consumption of fossil fuels. We didn't decline because of climate. That means someone else will buy it. If we don't, that oil will somehow make its way, maybe at a discount, maybe shipped illicitly or through dubious third parties, but will probably make its way, at least a lot of it, to other parts of the world. For example, China and India never cared for American sanctions, and they use a lot of oil, and they like discounted oil. So I think we might see a lot of that oil turning up there.
I heard you say that in a way we're okay with that because we don't want oil to go beyond where it is now. What is it, at over $100 a barrel? You said it could end up being $150 a barrel if we don't allow for that market to continue.
A bit of a nod and a wink in terms of American sanctions on energy, because when Secretary Blinken talked about imposing sanctions on Russia for oil that's imported to the US, he specifically also said, we want to ensure that there's an adequate supply of oil to the world market. You say, well, hold on a minute. You just said you're going to punish them, but at the same time you want, and what's going on here, of course, is that if we took all of Russia's oil, it's a massive amount of oil that Russia produces and exports off the world market, you would see a crisis going beyond what happened in the 1970s with the oil shocks. We would easily see $200 a barrel oil. That's the speculation in the oil industry, if that really happened. And so that's not what America has argued for. We've been quite explicit that we're not going to stop people from sending that oil to other places. The curious thing is, some of them are avoiding Russian oil anyway in a weird new behavior that's being called self-sanctioning, because it's become so repugnant as well as dangerous to take Russian cargoes. American sanctions are so overarching that middlemen like insurers and traders and shipping companies say, even though it's not illegal per se, I don't want to touch that Russian oil because the American Treasury might come after me. And so we're actually seeing a significant amount of Russian oil exports not be able to find buyers or people willing to transport it for that unrelated reason. It's not really about the oil embargo. It's about those other kinds of sanctions that America is using on Russia.
What does the world look like so the sanctions are not entirely symbolic, but in a way they are. What do we do if we have to continue this regime for, let's say, a couple of years? Does that start hurting us? It doesn't sound like it would.
If in fact we were to see the kind of sanctions we have now, and almost certainly they'll get tougher. In my conversations with administration officials, they made it very clear this is a ratcheting approach, that the only way to have sort of a carrot and a stick with somebody you're sanctioning is if you threaten to bludgeon them with tighter sanctions unless they improve their behavior. And equally, if they stop doing the bad thing, you promise to make the sanctions go away or get easier. That's the approach the US took with Iran, for example, that has gotten us close to now a deal. I mean, a deal that always seems just out of grasp, just a few months away or a few weeks away. But it was definitely the ratcheting concept. And so if there were to be a terrible situation with Russia for 2 years, let's say, then we would probably it would have very dramatic impact on energy markets and other commodities that would affect clean energy, for example, because Russia produces a lot of the rare earths and other critical minerals that are used in electric vehicle production and energy storage devices. So it's not just oil and gas, but it would also have effect on various forms of clean tech.
We cannot really supplement what we're missing with green technologies, renewable energy, because we haven't invested enough and we haven't put that infrastructure in place, correct? So this is not necessarily the world's opportunity to move towards renewables. It's more to falling back to, ramping up fracking and drilling in the United States. When you were in Houston, what were they saying?
So there's a big debate now. It's actually a very live and open question. Will the Russia crisis and the disruption in energy supplies, the fossil supplies that it represents, set back the energy transition, that is the ambitious way of moving towards cleaner energy, or could it in some strange way actually accelerate that transformation off of oil? I spent a week with the world's leading oil men, including the Saudis and OPEC, and of course all the big oil companies. And there's a strong view that we told you so, basically, to sum it up, that this is something we told you, that Biden administration particularly, but the European Commission and others were too green. They put emphasis on climate, but they neglected energy security and energy reliability. And at this moment in time, with this very unreliable supplier of Russia, what you need is the shale patch to drill more. You need to persuade our investors to let us spend more. Oil is here for you. We always were. And wishing us away, calling us a dying industry was a mistake. And so that's the sense of rebalance that the industry thinks it's getting, or it certainly is arguing for. And to some degree, that's going to happen. I mean, we saw at the conference, Secretary of Energy, while emphasizing climate goals are very important, she also put up her arms in sort of a loving gesture saying, we need you, oil industry, and gave a bit of love and said, please drill more. And that was not a message you would have heard from this administration openly previously. And I think that it just points to a harsh reality that though we may wish the dirtiest fuels to go away, in fact, we haven't taken the steps, the painful steps needed sometimes, and sometimes the courageous steps to act more vigorously on demand, right? We've been focused on supply and getting new kinds of renewables and wind, and that's super important. But the hard part starts with us, each one of us, but also with the policies and technologies that would enable a reduction in demand, substitution of efficient technologies, be that heat pumps or demand aggregation technologies that would reduce demand at peak. There's lots of things out there in the marketplace that are taking off, but they're nascent and they're not at scale. And we need to double and triple down on demand if we're going to have a chance to meet this crisis. Otherwise, the oil guys will be right. We are going to use more oil, and in Europe, they're going to use more coal to respond to the fact that they're trying to get off Russian gas. They don't have a lot of options, and renewables are not yet at scale in order to replace 40% of the gas that they get, which is from Russia.
On that, can you really clarify Nord Stream 2? Because I find it I just can't imagine after all this investment of time that Germany would completely abandon Nord Stream 2, especially after committing to turning off all their nuclear energy plants. What is the reality? So
Nord Stream 2 is a big pipeline connecting Germany and Russia that has never seen a molecule of natural gas flow through it, right? So let's call it what it is. It is, at the moment, irrelevant, and it has never contributed to German energy security or energy supply. But a lot of money was spent on it with German encouragement. That's the thing we need to remember. It's not a secret Russian plot whereby, it's like a submarine, it suddenly popped up on German shores saying, hey, Nord Stream 2 is here. This was done with the encouragement of German governments and policymakers, of German investors. German companies spent many hundreds of millions of euros on this. And it was at the very last stage of the marathon, the 26th mile of the marathon, when it's about to get final regulatory approval. And now it's met what's called a suspension, an indefinite suspension. So they haven't killed it, but they put it on life support. And so, what does this really mean? in a way, it's almost irrelevant to the conversation. The deeper problem in Germany is they've not had a grown-up approach to energy for a long, long time. They are among the greenest countries on earth. So they were early in subsidizing solar and getting that to scale. They're very sincere in their commitment to decarbonization, to dealing with climate change. And they've spent a lot on climate change related technologies like renewables. However, they decided to shut down all their nuclear power plants, which are carbon free, which have been run extremely safely under German regulation. And they decided to shut them all down well in advance of their useful life. That made the gap that they have to fill in terms of low carbon technology much, much bigger. And again, in a sort of complicity, I would argue, that Germany has had with Russia, they have quietly allowed their share of Russian gas as a share of their total energy mix to grow dramatically since 2009, when Vladimir Putin started to rattle his saber over Ukraine, cutting off the gas a bit. 2014, when he did it again, using the energy weapon with gas. And the feeling in Germany has always been that he might bother those minor irrelevant countries, but he would never dare cut off Germany. That's been the assumption. And therefore, they let their dependence, utter reliance on German gas grow, and therefore didn't make the hard choices. As an example, they did not diversify even their own gas use from other sources as much as they could have. Other European countries have built regasification facilities to import liquefied natural gas. That could come from America, from Qatar, from other places. Germany refused to build even one. And they're paying the price dearly now, because then they can't quickly take advantage of imported cargoes to get off of Russian gas quickly. They get their piped gas from Russia, which makes them dependent on it. And so in that way, as well as sort of lazy, or even you can say craven thinking, I would argue, not really thought through thinking, they've made themselves extremely reliant on the one tool they have, which is a dramatic scale up of renewables.
We don't have a lot of time in terms of the ppm in the atmosphere, so this is not good news for climate action.
Yes,
Yeah.
This is a crisis moment for, we can call it the COP26 momentum, right? That is the UN climate change gathering that happened late last year, where there was with all the wobbles and shakes, there was a global commitment to accelerate action on climate, more ambition, national action plans. And even with India wobbling on coal and the Saudis trying to play the spoiler role, the countries gathered, agreed, and committed to a greater ambition. And there was a double whammy, right? At that time, Europe was undergoing an energy shock related to price and natural gas availability. That had already cast a pall over that meeting in Scotland. And now with Russia playing the geopolitical card, we now see there is a supply shock as well. And that's meant that what's called the energy trilemma, right? The three pillars of energy policy. One is security, one is cost or economics, and the third is climate. Europe had very heavily weighted towards climate and maybe underweighted on the security and reliability area. They've done a dramatic rethink of how do you bolster security without compromising the climate pillar. And they announced a new energy policy just a few days ago, which actually tries to do both. That is, it tries to say we're going to dramatically reduce our imports of Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of this year. It's going to be very hard, I can be honest with you. But that's their ambition, to say, let's get as quickly off of Russian gas as possible. But in part, we're going to do that by dramatically expanding renewables. That's their bet, much more than their previous plan, which is called Fit for 55. They already had a very ambitious approach on climate and green targets. They're doubling down on that. In Germany, we've seen a phenomenal change. I mean, more change than in 30 years in policy, and becoming a little more grown up about it. What they're saying is, we will also try to get off of Russian gas. They're building these LNG regasification terminals. And what does that mean? That means they're importing gas from overseas to get off of Russian gas. That's the diversification piece of it. But the decarbonization piece of it, that is getting serious about climate, they're going to dramatically increase renewables. They've increased their targets, and they're dealing with the problem of intermittency. That is, sometimes the wind doesn't blow or the hydro is low, like happened last year in Europe, which created major energy shocks. They said, we'll be honest about it. We're going to rely on gas plants, natural gas peaking plants to support the renewables. We'll only use them if needed. But yes, we're going to say okay to new gas plants in Germany and to be used as backup. And they need to be hydrogen ready. We could talk about hydrogen as a topic, but they're betting on so-called green hydrogen, which is made from renewable energy. So these plants that they're committing to wouldn't be locked into natural gas for 30 years. They would be able to switch over whenever the hydrogen economy is ready to go. And so in a sense, this is a more, we can say, mature or balanced or pragmatic approach. It's not in line with historical green thinking, right? Because gas is an enemy. Gas is a fossil fuel. We should kill gas immediately, shut down gas. Where I live in New York City, we just passed an ordinance that says no new gas hookups in people's homes, right? And so here's Germany, the greenest of countries, now saying we're going to support new gas plants and build regas facilities. And you know what I say? Good, because the other approach wasn't working. This is more grown up.
And I think this is also an opportunity for DAC, direct air capture, and this idea that we do need to pull carbon out of the sky as part of the mix. And we need direct air capture and carbon capture. What would you say to that?
I think just bleeding greener than the next person and saying, I'm going to be even more virtuous than you by banning carbon capture or not allowing, natural gas during the transition, regardless of what we do to control methane emissions, right, which is an important topic, I think is actually harming the energy transition. It hurts efforts to actually get society together and move in a pragmatic way. For example, even the scientists at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN IPCC, have acknowledged that we're going to need direct air capture or other forms of net emissions. If you take a 2050 or 2100 view, which we must because it's a 100-year problem, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for that long or longer. It's not enough just to reduce or eliminate emissions. We have to look at the stock and the flow of the problem. That means we have to take emissions out, and various forms, whether it's nature-based solutions, which is trees and ag and other afforestation approaches, those are examples, or the geological sequestration or the direct air capture approaches that a lot of companies are investing in and innovating. I think we need all of them to be in a flurry of innovation to see what works, to see what can scale up, because we're going to need something or maybe many things 10, 20, 30 years out from now. And frankly, at the moment, we don't have anything at scale.
The realignment of energy alliances. It looks like India, China, they're not condemning Russia as vigorously as the West. So they are also markets for Russia. What do you see the future energy alignment being?
I think that there's going to be a fundamental realignment of not only energy markets, but also geopolitics coming out of this crisis, however it ends up. And I think one of the winners is going to be China. And China, I spent many years in China covering it for The Economist. And from the Chinese point of view, especially the Xi Jinping point of view, they see the West as decadent and failed. They had embraced Russia as an ally, in part because Russia was successful, was a winner, and also had a lot of resources to keep on side, and they were challenging America. We now see that if Russia fails or stumbles badly, China emerges as in a stronger position because it has had a threat to America and the West. And secondly, its commodity provider now needs it. So they will get much better deals, right? They're quite mercenary in negotiating for long-term contracts at reduced prices. After the last Ukraine incursion by Putin, which the world condemned but didn't really do anything about, China signed contracts with Russia for significant gas deals at a time when people were saying, hey, he's cutting off the gas supply to Ukraine. They're an unreliable supplier. The Chinese said, no, he's unreliable to you, but he'll be very reliable to us. We don't have any problems with Russia. And they signed major deals at a discount. So I think that's what's really going on. The Chinese will seek advantage, and they see that their role in the world is actually enhanced, because compared to Russia, suddenly, China looks okay. We can deal with China. At least they're not crazy.
Don't we see that from the Western point of view? Haven't we seen that we've been driving Russia towards China, even though Russia really wanted to belong to the West?
Russia and China have a long history as frenemies, certainly in modern times. If you look at the post-war period, they are allies of convenience, but they do not trust each other. And so I think that continues to this day. In part, their friendship arises from animosity and distrust of the West. And since Donald Trump and President Biden has continued this, we have had quite a hostile approach to dealing with China. And so they are responding in part to us. We have no great superpower has ever dealt well with a rising superpower. That's history. And that's certainly today. America is not dealing well with China's rise. And any of the positive aspects of globalization, of interconnectedness, of human to human relations, of supply chain integration that we enjoyed before Donald Trump got elected have really been torn apart in the last 4 years of his presidency, but also, it must be said, under that bipartisan animosity towards China on a multiplicity of issues that's now allowed to be vented openly. It would be considered, impolitic or inappropriate to talk about China in the way, about other countries the way that you're allowed to talk about China in polite society, to the point of really bordering on racism. And yet we allow it. And I think that's actually dangerous. China is a civilization with different values, and we have a lot of problems with it. But I think we've come to a place where we may not be able to get along with them, and that's a real problem for the U.S.
I agree. And to finish off this conversation, is there anything you would like to add? And at what point do you think any of these sanctions will encourage Putin to change course?
The thing to watch, really, out of all the bundle of policies that have been announced and sanctions, is really the control of central bank reserves. Putin had built up over $600 billion of central bank reserves, which is a nice war chest, which he thought would insulate his economy from being treated like a tin pot dictatorship, say Venezuela or Iran, who can be pushed around by the West. And it turns out, because of America's control over the global financial system in various ways, and the fact that Switzerland also joined, very unusually, with Europe and the US in some of these sanctions and actions, that means he can't get access to central bank reserves very easily. And that means any other little sanction, like squeezing his oil supplies, makes it very, very hard for him to fund his government for much longer. So that's the one to watch. And that's why he's like a wounded animal. But the problem is, wounded animals are very dangerous. And the more we corner him and take away options, more reckless his behavior might be, because he has very little to lose at some point. And so that's our great danger. To end on an optimistic note, I would say it is possible that some kind of negotiated settlement could give him a face-saving solution. It would involve us losing face for sure, and it would be humiliating for the Ukrainians. I don't see any good outcome where the patriotic and courageous sacrifices they've made can be honored and with their country intact and with reparations paid for the damage they've suffered. It's very hard to see a dignified outcome simply because he has nuclear weapons and we are not willing to go to war. That's where we stand, right? And so that's the grim state of affairs. I'm still hopeful a negotiated settlement that is morally troublesome might be possible, because it would save lives and it would restore the peace. But it's not a great outcome.